Okay, good morning, everyone. I see we have people logging in now. I'm just going to, this is Christine Hess. I'm the Executive Director for the Nevada Housing Coalition. And welcome. We have over 220 registered this morning. So I anticipate a good, robust conversation among yourselves, perhaps, and afterwards. Thank you so much for joining. I just want to quickly go over some of the logistics. All participants are entering in listen-only mode. And for those of you signed into the webinar by your computers, your video is off, but you can see the slides of the presenters. The chat feature has been disabled, but all questions and/or comments can be submitted through the Q&A feature on the toolbar. And if your question is not answered during the presentation or the Q&A, we will follow up. So the webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and a link to the recording will be emailed to all of the registrants and will also be available for viewing on the Nevada Housing Coalition website. So with that, I'd like to introduce the Nevada Housing Coalition Board Chairman and our moderator this morning, Bill Brewer.
Thank you, Christine. Good morning, everyone. As Christine said, I'm Bill Brewer, Board Chairman of the Nevada Housing Coalition. The Nevada Housing Coalition was formed just over a year ago to develop strategies and goals to address Nevada's affordable housing shortfall through community action and policy changes. We appreciate all of you joining us this morning. As you know, the coronavirus pandemic is a public health crisis that has also spawned a housing crisis. And as Nevada enters phase one of its reopening, it's imperative that we prepare for the sunset of foreclosure and eviction forbearance so that we do not face a wave of evictions and foreclosures when that time comes. This morning's mix of presenters represents the kind of diverse individuals and organizations that it's going to take for a healthy housing recovery. And we will also be learning about the tools and resources that are available to us as we develop a strategic approach to these issues from all of our state and federal partners. And to support a strategic recovery, it's often helpful to look back in order to look forward. Nevada Housing Coalition has partnered with the Gwynn Center to help understand our housing economy and trends before and after the Great Recession. We know this pandemic is not the Great Recession, but there are similarities that may give us some insights to help anticipate some needs of our Nevadans. And finally, we'll hear from some of our housing partners that will share their observations as they anticipate the recovery and give us a look at how they're actively working with their members and clients. I'm thrilled to begin this morning with an update from Senator Cortez Masto's office by Carol Wayman, her legislative assistant. We're so grateful to have Carol helping us here in Nevada and watching out for all the federal legislation. Thank you for being with us. Carol.
Thank you, Bill. I really appreciate the invitation, and Christine, for you all bringing together the Nevada Housing Coalition. I think Bill's 100% right that this this health crisis is exacerbating what was already an affordable housing crisis and making it way worse. I know that we've had more than 300,000 people in Nevada apply for unemployment insurance. I know it's taking a while for that money to get out and even for people to apply. We also know that we're expecting over 108,000 cost-burdened, extremely low-income renters, including more than 51,000 very low-income renters who are going to need at least $1 billion in rental assistance. So the senator has been focused on affordable housing and expanding the supply of affordable housing for quite some time. If we'll go to the next slide, I'll just give you a quick overview. You might have heard yesterday that Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in the House proposed a bill that had quite a lot of funds for housing in it. Oh, and before I go further, I just wanted to say that my remarks are my own views and should not be construed as representing the senator. So just to put that out there. And the good thing about what the Nancy Pelosi put forward is that it was at the scale to address the problem that we see of tens of millions of people being unable to afford their rent or pay their mortgage while the economy has been decimated the way it has as we respond to the illnesses and the pandemic. So one of the bills the senator has introduced is a housing assistance fund that she has co-sponsored with Senator Jack Reed, and there's some details on it. It includes a 5% set aside for tribal communities, and it would put in money to help keep people in their homes. This is very similar to something that was in Speaker Pelosi's bill, which has $75 billion to homeowners to help with mortgages, insurance, utilities, and taxes. If we go on to the next slide, this Speaker Pelosi also put in a $100 billion rental assistance fund, which is similar to what the senator has co-sponsored a bill to be introduced. And those are funds that would help with make rent, make utility payments to help some of those 108,000 people in Nevada we know are really going to struggle to make their rent. Speaker Pelosi's bill also had a number of other funds at the level that we need: $4 billion for tenant-based rental assistance, $2 billion for public housing authority operating, $100 million for tribal housing, $5 billion for CDBG, $11 billion for homelessness, money for the elderly at $500 million, $200 million for disability and help for people with disabilities, and $100 million in housing counseling, among other things. So there's a real push in the House side to make sure that there's the money that we need for housing. But what's going to happen in the Senate is looking very dicey and very not the same approach. The leadership in the Senate, Senator McConnell, the leader of the Senate, has said that he's not going to consider anything in the House bill and basically feels like his job is done. So now we're starting the negotiating process of what are we going to do to help people get the funds that they need to pay their rent and keep food on their table. So if we can go on to the next slide. The senator is also proposing some uses of other types of funds in addition to what's coming through the federal government. And we know we've got money from CDBG that's come, and the first tranche, the second tranche just came out. It was about $9.9 million to Nevada, and that should be going up a little bit. And then there'll be a third tranche of CDBG money coming out. And then there'll be some public and Indian housing money coming a bit to Nevada probably next week. We also want to get some money from some resources from the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. The senator had a call with the acting president there on March 20th to ask what they were going to do. We've talked a lot about how the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco could do more for Nevada. And if we go on to the next slide, you'll see that Nevada's really struggled to get access to some of the Federal Home Loan Bank funds around affordable housing. So one of the things that's come out just in the last couple days is a $1.8 million grant program from the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, where any of the 30 Nevada banks and credit unions that are members can apply for a $5,000 grant from the Federal Home Loan Bank, match it with their own money, and distribute it to a nonprofit, to a group, to an individual. It's pretty flexible money, and that could bring an additional $300,000 into Nevada. If we go on to the next slide. They've also announced a $1 billion HEAD program, and one of the things the senator is talking about now is additional bill around the Federal Home Loan Bank that would double the affordable housing program, which we would hope would get more resources to Nevada. It would also include a 2% set aside for Native American tribes as grantees in the 30 years that the Federal Home Loan Bank has been operating the affordable housing program. There's only been one award to a tribe in Nevada. So that's one bill that we're looking at. We'd love to get your feedback. I've shared it with Christine and with Bill, and just, we're trying to find funds in addition to the funds coming through HUD or through USDA Rural Development, but trying to find other resources of funds that are really important. This one I know is helpful because it's matching funds. So if you need matching dollars for local fund, for federal funds, the Federal Home Loan Bank money can provide that match. That's one of the new bills she's considering. And the next bill, if we go on to the next slide, is to create a community economic development program, also at the Federal Home Loan Bank. So in addition to the housing side, there'd be money for economic development, child care centers, community facilities. And you can see that Nevada has not competed that well in that category either over the years. Now, if we go to the next slide, we have one more bill I wanted to mention that we're considering, and that's to get some flexibility in the mortgage revenue bonds and mortgage credit certificate programs. I know that mortgage credit certificates and bonds are used to help finance housing, rental and home ownership. And we've just got some changes to allow for example, more home improvement loans. A number of people are going to want to stay in place and not move into an assisted living facility. So expanding the home improvement loans allows them to do that. Allowing refinancing if you've got folks who can't stay in their current mortgage, but you might be able to work with them. You might be able to use a mortgage revenue bond to refinance them into a new mortgage that they could pay the monthly payments. So these are some of the two bills that she's looking at, the other bills that she's co-sponsored, and we're going to be in the fight for trying to make sure that there is another bill. I think it would be a tragedy if this was all that Congress was going to provide in relief funding. We desperately need more investment and want to make sure that housing is financed at the level of what we need. So let me turn that back over to you, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. Great to run down on what's happening in Washington right now. We know it's challenging to keep up with all of that, but we surely appreciate the watchful eye that you and the Senator are keeping for us. Next up is our state treasurer, who's been charged with overseeing the state's effort to implement policy on evictions and foreclosure forbearance. He's been hard at work to prepare our state to come out of the quarantine. Zach Conine, thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having me. And again, thanks to everybody for getting together and having this dialogue. I'm Zach Conine. I'm your state treasurer. I want to thank the Nevada Housing Coalition for bringing us all together this morning. I'm hopeful that through dialogue and collaboration, the people on this call can help us work towards finding innovative housing solutions as we deal with the virus and its aftermath. Since March, we've seen claims for unemployment benefits skyrocket, with about 28% of Nevada's workforce already having filed. Unemployment benefits have gone a long way to help a large portion of displaced workers in making their monthly rent and mortgage payments. But we also know that a lot of individuals who have filed have not yet received payments or are waiting for the pandemic unemployment assistance, the quote-unquote gig worker assistance, to come through. But all those benefits are only guaranteed through the end of June. We need to be thinking about ways that we can work collaboratively so that people can stay in their homes, but also get back on their feet as we start our economic recovery. We learned some significant lessons from the housing crisis of 2008. For instance, the banking industry has come to terms with the idea that foreclosing on a large number of homes creates additional housing supply that can be challenging to resell. I think if given the opportunity to make the decisions that they made in 2008, 2009, 2010, we'd see a good number of banks, mortgage servicers, and credit unions making different decisions. And that's played out in some of what we've seen so far at a state and a national level. As Carol said, CARES Act was a great first step in helping to secure federal dollars, and specifically included funds for housing in Nevada, like the $13.5 million in CBDG funds, the $5.2 million in ESG funds from HUD in the first tranche, and the following tranches to come, and over $836 million in CRF, or Coronavirus Relief Funds, which can go to support Nevadans who are struggling due to COVID-19, as well as obviously plenty of other purposes. In the Treasurer's Office, we've largely been focused on how we can take additional risks off the table for Nevada families. So we encourage them to start spending money and stimulating the economy. Our goal is to remove overhangs so that the slope of economic recovery is as steep as possible. And this is things like making sure that we don't have credit impacts, making sure that we don't have big bulk balloon payments at the end of mortgage forbearance, so that individuals are able to kind of get back to work and get back to spending. We talked a little bit about that on the last call. The CARES Act went through and codified a lot of the decisions and agreements that banks and credit unions and mortgage servicers had made, and that's fantastic. The GSEs, your Fannie Mae's, Freddie Mac's, have now issued guidance where loans that they backed will not be subject to lump sum payments at the end of the forbearance period. This was huge for Nevada homeowners. I think there was a lot of concern, and now we're seeing obviously that same concern on the rental side about what happens when this forbearance period ends. And so now we know that there's a solution on the mortgage side. Additionally, mortgage servicers are starting to understand the economic landscape of COVID, and we're continuing to push for equitable solutions at the end of the forbearance period. I feel like we're really moving in a positive direction. So now that there's a structure and agreed upon solution for homeowners across the state, we need to address the I guess the second elephant in the room, which is what are we going to do to help support Nevada's renters and landlords who've been affected by COVID-19? We know that roughly 45% of Nevadans are renters, and almost a third of those households were rent burdened prior to COVID-19. With average rents for a 2-bedroom apartment ranging from $1,100 to $1,300 a month, depending on the county, the average Nevadan needs to make $18.85 an hour to afford rent and utilities without dedicating over 30% of their income to housing alone. It's clear with so many people out of work, we've got to figure out an equitable solution that can get people back on their feet as quickly as possible. We started with the governor's emergency directive, number 8, which painted a broad brush to keep people in their homes, forbidding evictions and foreclosure processes during the times of the crisis. The eviction moratorium, and I think this is important, is tied to the public health emergency. So until the public health emergency ends, the eviction moratorium will continue. But now we need to fine-tune the government response to aid in the payment of back rent. So far, we've seen that roughly 87% of Nevadans were able to pay their rent in April. And as of May 6th, we've seen that number drop to roughly 80% nationally. Even though these numbers aren't as drastic as of yet, Las Vegas, of course, remains one of the hardest hit communities from COVID-19 and currently leads the nation in missed rent payments for April and May. For some folk, the expanded unemployment benefits will make it so that they can still pay their rent on time with little interruption to their monthly budget. That's great, right? That means that the system is working like it's supposed to. However, as our unemployment system struggles to meet the demands of gig workers and independent contractors, as well as the individuals who just based on the volume coming into the UI system are unable to get benefits yet, we need to be thinking about ways we can help people who need it the most. If someone is struggling to make ends meet now, it's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to pay 3 or 4 months of missed rent payments when the moratorium is lifted. States across the country are in the same boat as we are and have been exploring ways to ensure that renters and landlords are taken into account during the recovery. We know that in order to get through this crisis, Nevadans are going to have to work together. We're going to share ideas, but we're also going to have to make some tough choices with some shared sacrifices. So now, in the same way that we've approached the mortgage issue, we're looking to engage and have engaged the private sectors on ways that we can mitigate the effect of COVID-19 on Nevada renters and on landlords. We've been collaborating with groups like the Apartment Association, the Realtors Association, and Legal Aid Center of Southern Nevada to figure out a solution that can work for our parties involved. We're still working out the details, but we're hopeful that all stakeholders involved are committed to finding a mutually agreed upon solution with the practical ability to implement it. I'm hopeful that we're able to share additional information and guidance soon, but in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out to our office should you have any specific questions and ways we can help. Additionally, you're all experts in the housing field. You might see something that another state or municipality is doing that seems clever or effective. We always appreciate that feedback and information. I know the Housing Coalition, the Attorney General's Office, the state's housing division, and landlord-tenant organizations are committed to finding a solution that helps the majority of tenants stay in their homes without going through a lengthy and complicated eviction process. If we're going to avoid a potential crisis when it comes to Nevada's renters, we're all going to have to work together to figure out a solution that works for everyone. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Happy to answer any questions from the group. And as you can see on the slide, always feel free to reach out to our office at ask@nevadatreasurer.gov. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Treasurer Conine. Really appreciate you joining us this morning and taking the time to prepare and be with us. We are looking forward to those collaborative solutions and anxious to hear about those as you reach conclusions. Next up is the Director of HUD's Nevada office, and I might remind our listeners as well that we'll be capturing questions from the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, feel free to type those in, and we'll be sure to pose those to our panelists today. Next up is the Director of HUD's Nevada office, Tammy Thomas. She'll be talking to us about HUD distributions of funding from the CARES Act, and I believe she has a special guest with her as well. Tammy?
Thank you, Bill and Christine. and to the Nevada Housing Coalition. As I stated on our last call, for HUD to be a better, more effective partner, knowing what's going on across the state with all these moving parts is going to be important so that we can target our efforts and be as effective as we can. And I want to echo the treasurer's comment about the fact that, we're facing a real crisis in terms of the renters in the state. So that's going to take a concerted effort by all of us to try to mitigate what is going to be an impending, I think, disaster. But I am joined by my esteemed colleague out of the San Francisco HUD office, Kim Nash. And Kim is the Regional Director for Community Planning and Development. That covers Arizona, Nevada, California, and Hawaii. So I wanted her to provide some updates on the second allocation of CARES Act funding, CDBG, CV, and a little bit to talk a little bit about the methodology that was used for allocating the funds and any other insights she might have about round 3 of the funding. So, Kim?
You may be muted, Kim. Can you check your mute with a *6, perhaps?
Kim, your line is open now, I think.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There we go.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone. I wanted to give you a little bit of background, and thank you, Tammy. It's always good to work with Tammy as our director for the Nevada State Office. We have an additional $1 billion allocation out of the CDBG $5 billion. The first round was already awarded, and now we're in round 2. The round 2 funding is specifically for states. And up on the screen, you'll see what that designation has been in terms of the CARES Act distribution for CDBG and for our Emergency Solutions Grant and our HOPWA program as well. So the focus on round 2, as I said, was specifically for the states, and the law made it clear that HUD was to consider some particular factors: public health need, risk of transmission of the coronavirus, the number of coronavirus cases compared to the national average, economic, housing, and market disruptions, and other factors as determined by the Secretary. As a result of that, HUD derived a formula, and the formula took in, under public health need, it considered the count of low-income elderly, and it considered the count of children in poverty. And the count of low-income elderly was weighted at 50% in terms of the formula allocation, and the count of children in poverty was weighted at 10% of the formula allocation. The next factor was economic, housing, and market disruptions. And in order to gather that information, HUD looked at unemployment insurance information, as we just heard a discussion about unemployment in the state of Nevada. And they looked at the past 6 weeks through April 25th, 2020, to derive that number. And that was also weighted and taken into account for 40% of the formula. The next factor that was considered was the risk of transmission of the coronavirus. HUD used an adjusted count per capita on confirmed cases as of May 3rd, 2020, in order to calculate that for jurisdictions. So those were the factors that were taken into account in deriving at the award amounts. And as you can see, in round 2 of the funding, that resulted in $9.9 million for the state of Nevada. In the first round, there was a $2 million award to the state, And, you know, we have an additional 1.6 million that came from ESG, and the HOPWA number was substantially lower, excuse me. So, and as you know, you have a number of large entitlements for Nevada as well that are receiving funds directly. So the aggregate of that funding has resulted in HUD contributions to assist in preventing risk of continued transmission, responding to the moment on the crisis of the day. And so that's what HUD has been able to contribute to the CARES Act funding for the state of Nevada at this point. So with regard to round 3, we don't have a timetable on that round 3 funding yet. The statute doesn't give some specific deadlines for that round 3 the way that it did for round 1 and round 2. I do know that the administration wants to deploy these funds as quickly as possible, and so they're already working on, you know, a methodology for determining that third allocation. And when we have more information, we'll be happy to share that with you. I'm available for any questions, and I'm going to stay through the duration of the call, and happy to answer any questions you have about the funding resources that HUD has committed to the state to combat COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy and Kim. Great to know about those federal funding resources that are coming to Nevada, and I know we'll have some questions for you on that and distribution coming up at the end of our meeting. So thank you very much. Appreciate you staying on.
Sure.
As the Housing Coalition has looked for lessons learned from past recoveries, we've asked the Gwynn Center, a bipartisan research and policy analysis group here in Nevada, to help us take a statistical look at past recoveries and what we might learn from them. With us this morning to share what we found are Meredith Levine and Dan Leiden from the Gwynn Center. Dan and Meredith.
Good morning. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today, and to Christine and Bill, the Nevada Housing Coalition, for inviting the Gwynn Center to present on the impact of recessions on the economy, and of course, housing more specifically. We think that by looking at the metrics for Nevada following 9/11 and the 2007 to 2009 recession, that we can provide insight into the potential effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. We do start with a bit of a qualifier, which is that the events included in the comparison, again, 9/11 and the Great Recession, they differed substantially from each other and from the present circumstances. So if you look at 9/11, the country was already in a small recession, and the military escalation afterwards may have actually ended the recession sooner than it would have ended otherwise. The 2007 to 9 recession lasted for several years before recovery, and the recovery from the recession took place over the course of many years. It was specifically related to housing, so there's always the chance that some of those insights are very housing specific and not applicable here. The other point we would say is that the current pandemic has had a much more rapid onset than the 2007-9 recession, and the background conditions are different than those prior to 9/11. So while the specific circumstances around these events are different from the present ones, meaning that none of this should be predictive, they can still help us to anticipate potential challenges related to housing stability, and that's useful for the coming months and years ahead. So before we really get into it, just want to emphasize almost the conclusion, which is 2 points as we present the following slides on economic and housing market trends in Nevada. First is that pre-pandemic, not only had the economy not recovered to pre-recession levels, but recession effects often are not as pronounced in the short term as they may be in the long term. We're calling this the lagged effect. That's an economic term, but we're going to use that here. And we've heard about some of the very current pronounced effects on unemployment, etc. But again, as we'll see through these slides, that actually also has a long-term impact. So we want to be thinking long-term. The other point that we would say is that in the recovery period of the Great Recession, some people benefited significantly, but others did not see an improvement in their financial circumstances or were left worse off. And so we see those as uneven gains. So with that, if we could turn to the first slide on median household income in Nevada. Median household income provides a powerful example of the lag effects of the 2007-9 recession. Median household incomes did not reach their low point until 2012. So if you consider that the typical starting date for the Great Recession is December 2007, that's actually quite a bit of time until we saw where median household incomes really took their dip. As of 2018, almost a decade after the end of the Great Recession, median household income in Nevada still has not returned to the pre-recession level, and this is after adjusting for inflation. So really consider that as we went into the pandemic, in real dollars, median household income was not where it was in 2007. Next slide, please. This figure shows the percentage of people in poverty in Nevada between 2000 and 2018. And while the poverty rate has declined since its peak in 2011 at 15.9%, it still remains higher than it was pre-recession in 2007 when it was 10.8%. So we see here again the lagged effect that's in evidence, as the highest rate of poverty was several years after the recession hit, again 2011. That not everyone benefited equally from recovery is demonstrated by the fact that the 2018 poverty rate exceeded the 2007 poverty rate. Next slide. This is the All Transactions House Price Index, or HPI, for Nevada. HPI is a broad measure of the movement of single-family house prices. As with the previous indicators, recovery has been a lengthy process. So single-family house prices only begin to increase in 2013 and return to pre-recession levels in 2019. And based on the All Transactions HPI, it's possible that we're in a situation similar to that just before the Great Recession, following several years of sharply increasing house prices. But as the next slide shows, the home vacancy rate now is a lot lower than it was in the build-up to the recession. So yeah, great, slide 4. So home vacancy rates climbed quite a bit while rental vacancy rates dropped in the years following 9/11. However, both of these metrics peaked during the Great Recession and dropped in the years following. Both are currently very, very low. Next slide. Okay, so as this figure shows, 9/11 did not seem to have much of an impact on the home ownership rate. On the other hand, the rate of home ownership increased, albeit very marginally, in the first year after the recession. That's in 2008, when it was 63.6%. Then it began to decline, and the low watermark for home ownership was actually in 2016. The 2019 home ownership rate of 58.2% shows that home ownership hasn't fully recovered. Our two main effects are pronounced in this slide then. The home ownership rate really doesn't show much evidence of recovery until 2018, or about a decade after the Great Recession, and then not even in full. And home ownership, which can really be a marker for wealth, has not been possible for many Nevadans. Slide. So this is median gross rent in Nevada. Gross rent is the contract rent, what you typically think of as the rental rate, plus the estimated average monthly cost of utilities. Adjusted for inflation, it peaked in 2007, dropped in each subsequent year through 2016, and then increased again in each 2017 and 2018. Median gross rent behaves in expected ways then. When you think about economy and supply and demand, both shifted in the aftermath of the recession. So here you see a price decrease. From the perspective of property managers, of course, rental income hasn't recovered to pre-recession levels either. While this should have been to the benefit of renters, that's actually not quite the case, as we'll see in the next slide. So again, the previous slide showed that the drops in median gross rent should have been to the benefit of renters, but as this figure shows, the Great Recession appears to push some people from the moderately to the severely burdened category until 2012, which is some years out from the initial recessionary hit. We also see a pretty significant increase in housing burden starting up again in 2017 in both categories, which might give some additional cause to worry about current circumstances. Next slide. Rent burden is really uneven by income level and considerably so. So the trends following the recession differ. Rent burden among households earning more than $35,000 declined from 2007 to 2014. While for those earning less than $35,000, it increases during the recession and remains around or above pre-recession levels even years later. So in 2014, the percent of rent burden households among low-income households is still above pre-recession levels, while it's about 7.5 percentage points lower for higher income households. While this figure highlights how much more rent burdened low-income households are regardless of the underlying economic conditions, it does suggest that diminished income has been a driver of housing affordability issues post-recession. And note that many of those who lost their jobs or weren't able to work from home, these are the same folks that likely didn't have additional savings and are also lower income. So you see that real income effect a bit more than the housing market effect, although that does play a role as well. Next slide. So this puts together two metrics that we think are really valuable to take in tandem, which is unemployment and eviction rates. So post-Great Recession, the unemployment rate peaked at 13.7% in September 2010. That's nearly 3 years after the first recession hit, or the recession first hit, excuse me, which is a fairly significant lag. It remained fairly high into 2012, with the first signs of recovery not really felt until that year. Then it continues on a sharp decline, ultimately dropping below the recession rate in August 2017. That is not on this slide, but I think it's worth noting that we did hit our lowest unemployment rate over the entire period in February 2020 based on recent numbers. So that's just sort of a pause that we can all take. Now, looking at how this interacts with evictions, evictions declined leading into the recession and during the sharpest increase in unemployment, but they increased as unemployment declined and continued to increase for several years following the recession. This suggests that even as relief checks are distributed and eviction moratoriums are enacted, which are hugely important, it's really important to think long-term. So if we just think about this and kind of synthesize the data, put it all together, regardless of the metric, the data seems to indicate two recurring themes. First, the effects of the recession are lagged, or at least we can see that with the Great Recession. But specifically, unemployment, rent burden, poverty, etc., reached their peaks in 2011 and 12, just as median incomes hit their low points. And as I noted when discussing the previous slide, this suggests that the aftershocks can be prolonged, requiring more long-term solutions. Second, given that we know, at least in the short term, that the current crisis is concentrated in some of the most low-paying job sectors, and in the wake of the Great Recession, recovery gains were distributed unevenly, we should be mindful that many Nevada families, households, etc., could be facing a housing crisis that will require policy interventions to address. Thank you, and I look forward to questions you may have.
Really fascinating data from the Gwynn Center. Thank you, Meredith and Dan. Really appreciate that look. And I know that there will be some interesting questions that come from that.
Thank you, Bill.
Next, you bet. Next, we'll hear from the administrator of the Nevada Housing Division, Steve Acroth, about the funding that's been made available for housing relief in Nevada and NHD's role in the recovery. Steve?
Thank you, Bill. And thank you to the Nevada Housing Coalition, Senator Cortez Masto's office, Treasurer Conine, HUD, Gwynn Center, for all of their collaboration during this extraordinary times. In discussing the role of the Housing Division and the statewide recovery framework means we first need to peel back the onion that is the statewide disaster recovery plan. And the division has been working for the past couple years with the Nevada Department of Emergency Management in developing the disaster recovery plan specifically for housing. There is a recovery support function that the Housing Division is the primary agency. And I want to kind of, again, peeling back that onion, talk about how response differs from recovery in a traditional disaster framework. So if you have a flood or an earthquake, the immediate response comes from FEMA. And in housing, FEMA provides the manufactured housing units or the trailers, and we've seen those, fortunately not in Nevada specifically, but in other places affected by hurricanes and such. Because this is a slow-moving disaster, and it evolves on a daily basis, we're seeing response and recovery functions happen simultaneously. And specifically going to the recovery part, which is what the housing division is the primary entity for, typically it's done through CDBG disaster relief funds, which are specifically designed for this type of function. And then we would work with GOED, who is the recipient of those funds. We would partner with local jurisdictions, nonprofits, to begin recovery efforts. And this one is different because what we're seeing is, as has been presented previously, is CDBG CV funds, specifically for the coronavirus, extended ESG funds, the HOPWA funds, the direct corona relief funds. So we have a number of funding sources coming through, not necessarily direct to the division, but to deal with the response. And the ones that come directly to the division specifically are the ESG funds or the Emergency Solutions Grants, and those are to assist with rapid rehousing and homelessness. And we received our first tranche, as was indicated previously, of about $6 million, with 1.6 going to the non-entitlement jurisdictions. So that's the balance of the state other than some of the metro areas. And we are currently working with both GOED, who received the initial round of CDBG funding, and the Department of Health and Human Services, who received the HOPWA money, the Housing Opportunity Persons with AIDS money, in developing a substantial amendment, and that is currently in comment period, or if it's not currently in comment period, it will be shortly. So that's the first tranche. The second tranche is coming down the pike. And the first tranche nationally was $1 billion. The second allocation nationally is almost $3 billion. And HUD is developing a new formula, I think very similar to the CDBG second allocation, which just hit the other day. And we expect to see that by June 25th. Without knowing what that formula looks like, we're already having internal discussions on how to receive and allocate that funding. In regards to the CDBG funding that was just received on Monday, I will tell you that there is a higher level departmental discussion with GOED in relation to that funding source. So that's sort of the framework for the disaster recovery. I want to touch on a couple of other things very, very quickly, just for general information. With homeownership, we have partnered with the Nevada Affordable Housing Assistance Corporation, or NAHAC, and working with providing $5.5 million of hardest hit funds to go to the Unemployment Mortgage Assistance Program. That was launched last week and is expected to assist 1,300 homeowners. With renters, as was explained by Treasurer Conine, we are working with his office on the eviction prevention program. Data, we are working, we have our economists kind of working in concert with some of the folks statewide, doing what the Gwynn Center did, evaluating the 2007 recession. And there are two dates that sort of concern us most moving forward, and that's when the $600 in federal assistance, which I believe Dieter just announced today, that they have the program to enable that to get into people's pockets, so that's really good news. But when that expires, and when the eviction moratorium expires, that's when we know we are going to see a relative tsunami, if you want to talk about disasters, in regards to rental properties and the potential impact on residents. We also anticipate, because that funding source, the $600 will end up at the end of July, that it's the end of July and end of August, and that's given the current landscape. And I want to emphasize that the landscape changes almost on a daily basis. And that's one thing that becomes very difficult, as I mentioned, in a slow-moving disaster. Things change, and the virus changes, and the funding, we hear different things happening, and so it's a lot to get your arms around. But we do see a couple of issues regarding residents being able to pay rent as the end of July, end of August comes, and understanding it's extraordinarily difficult for some folks now, but at that time, here in the future, we anticipate families will be impacted greater than seniors, particularly those seniors who are on a fixed income. Families may have had 1, 2 jobs, and both of those may be gone. And because of that, we are particularly concerned regarding evictions coming around the holidays and in the dead of winter, and then also in the development of potential eviction relief plans that I think will probably be talked about a little bit later. We have concerns regarding evicting families as the school year ends for 2020 and 2021. And that concludes what I had to say, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Steve. Sure, it's good to hear from you, and we'll have some questions for you as well at the end of our conference here. We'd like now to hear from some of our housing professionals who are in the trenches facing these housing issues head on every day. We'll hear first from Susie Vasquez, the Executive Director of the Nevada State Apartment Association. Susie?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us to this amazing panel discussion. It's been really enlightening to hear from different organizations and how they're addressing a response to our current issues. First, I'd like to explain exactly who the Nevada State Apartment Association is. We represent property owners and managers throughout the state of Nevada. Our board is made up of 30 members who manage both in the north and the south. We have a strong board of 6 up in northern Nevada who keeps me updated on a regular basis as to what they're experiencing on a normal everyday. And then I have our offices here in southern Nevada. We currently represent close to 160,000 units, which is almost 60% of multifamily units in the state of Nevada. Our purpose is primarily in educating our members in best practices. We also provide them with legal guidance and advocacy on behalf of our industry. I do want to mention that our industry is not just multifamily. It truly takes a village to run and operate and maintain our communities. So we look to a number of other industries to support us in maintaining our communities. I also want to clarify that we are in the business of maintaining occupied units. We don't manage vacancy. And I really want everyone to understand that even though people do pay rent for their particular unit, it's a collective effort of rent collection from that community in order for us to continue to operate that community as one. As far as rent collection, I was going to report what's in line with what Treasurer Conine had reported, which rent collection currently is at 80%. Some workforce housing is a little bit behind that, but the average currently that's being reported is 80%, which compares to what the national average is. Southern Nevada obviously is a little bit behind Northern Nevada in collecting rents, but we are happy to report that we continue to encourage our members to maintain open lines of communication with our residents. Our residents have been doing a phenomenal job at keeping us up to date as to what is going on in their lives so we can then better prepare them to move forward. I'd like to also let everyone know that we are in collaboration with a number of government agencies, including the Attorney General's office, Treasurer Conine's office, and a number of other agencies to ensure that payment plans are standardized as much as possible. And we look ahead to opening up the courts once the eviction moratorium is lifted. Again, we're not in the business of evicting people. We want to keep our residents, especially those that have had phenomenal or excellent payment histories with us. Those are residents that we want to keep in our communities, and that is our primary focus. We recently met with the Culinary Union and now are able to better gather more data as to what the impact to Nevadans is. It's been really hard for us to determine who's getting what, who's eligible for what. And now that we're able to see kind of a clearer picture, at least from their membership standpoint, as to the overall impact, we're able to kind of relieve some worries from our members on whether or not, their residents truly have the capacity to be able to pay their rents. And that's why we feel that the 80% rent collection in the month of May it is amazing. And again, as we continue to collect data on who's getting what and when, we'll be able to better look forward to the future in making payment arrangements with our residents. We also have been implementing a phasing plan in order to not confuse it with the governor's phasing plan. We are calling them stages and guiding our members to ensure that all safety protocols and everything is looked at as we begin phasing our operations back in. I want also everyone to understand that we are probably the only industry that has not closed down our offices. We continue to provide services to our residents. We continue to maintain essential services to their homes. And so the phasing in plan is kind of difficult for us because we really never left the original phase. We continue to be essential and continue to service our communities. But we are moving forward and looking to reopening our amenities and our common areas in line with the governor's direction with social distancing. But our residents are really anxious to get back into pools. And I thought I just wanted to let everybody know that people are happy, people are healthy, and people are looking forward to getting back to normal. With that said, our leasing velocity has increased significantly in Nevada as it has across the nation. And I know that's going to impact a lot of our phasing plans because really leasing velocity, people are still looking to move. People are continuing to, with their plans that they had prior to the pandemic, to once their lease was ending, to be looking towards a new place to live or maybe a different area of town. People are moving in from out of state, which is really, really interesting as that trend continues. I do want to let you know that our forecast for multifamily is looking to see some rent decreases over the next year. We are going to see an increase in concessions or move-in specials, I guess is what is more commonly used, of, half a month up to a month free. I know I've been seeing some 2-month free offers out there in our new construction developments. And we're not anticipated to recover currently until Q1 of 2021. However, leasing velocity being what it is, we may be able to recover a bit sooner than that. Most importantly, I do want to let everybody know that we are a resource to any government agency, any legislator, any nonprofit out there that is having difficulties with any landlord, be it they be a member or not. I do have connections to almost everybody in the state of Nevada and willing to reach out and mediate any concerns that you may have. We work strongly with Nevada Legal Services and Legal Aid to ensure that they know that we're a resource. And more as we get the word out that we are here to help everyone, more and more people are reaching out to us. I probably spend 40% of my day mediating between the tenant advocacy group and a landlord. So please feel free to reach out. Again, we're in the business to maintain housing. We're not looking to manage vacant units. We're doing what we can to encourage rental assistance be, directly sent to those resources that are already set up and running. We feel that that's probably the easiest way to get money into the hands of those who need it desperately at this time. And I'd like to again thank you for the opportunity.
Great information. Thank you so much, Susie. Great to hear that perspective from the Apartment Association. Next, we'll be pleased to hear from Kristen Cooper, an Assistant Director with Clark County Social Services. Kristen has been overseeing public investments of home and CDBG dollars in Clark County for years and has now been charged with heading up the Multi-Agency Coordination Center's efforts to address the recovery efforts in Clark County. Kristen?
Thanks, Bill, and thank you everybody for inviting me, and I appreciate being on. I'm assuming you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I wanted to have something to upload, but I didn't get it in time to you guys, but I wanted to start with, while we are now moving into the recovery phase, RSF4 is what the technical term is for the recovery on housing. I wanted to give you just a brief synopsis of what we have already done in terms of trying to address this crisis in terms of housing for people who were COVID positive, people who were exposed and whose status was unknown. We call those people PUI, and person under investigation. And then for high-risk populations, 65 plus and or people with underlying medical conditions that make them more vulnerable and also make them more vulnerable to poor outcomes if they get sick. So I wanted to provide just a real quick synopsis of that. Some of the resources include Crossroads and WellCare, which had 33 and 14 beds respectively for people who were COVID positive being discharged from the hospitals who needed to go to isolation because they either couldn't return home for some reason, maybe somebody else at their home was also high risk, or they didn't have a home to return home to, so they needed to recover. We tried it at Salvation Army. We had a 32-bed facility, but it was a congregate facility for people with 65 plus, and because testing wasn't available and we've had some other issues, we ended up not being able to continue that, which helped us move to what turned out to be our strategy as through the MAC, the Multi-Agency Coordination Center, which was to secure hotel and motel rooms for households for all three of the categories, but particularly for people who are high-risk individuals needing quarantine, and particularly those who were without current residence, so the homeless. And we have WellCare Living, which is an entire Super 8 hotel that is set aside 108 units for people in that high-risk category. It currently has about 60 people in there. And then the Rita Suites, where we had also hotel rooms for high-risk people needing quarantine. And in all cases, people are provided with meals or food to be able to cook on their own. In Rita Suites, they have little kitchenettes. So, and then at the WellCare, there's also some medical security and some light touch case management provided. As you can imagine, with all of these locations, there's a lot of things to consider. It was a very heavy lift, and it's not perfect, nor has it been perfect. We're finding that many of these folks, of course, who are 65 plus, who are homeless, also have many underlying medical conditions that are either not being treated or are not being treated well. And so getting them into regular medical care and getting them regular medications has been a really important piece of that we are still not completely up to speed on. We also engaged Help of Southern Nevada to their mobile crisis intervention team. They created a COVID-19 response team, and those are the folks who are going out and finding these high vulnerable homeless people in the community and bringing them into shelter and into quarantine if they want to come. And this is a completely voluntary program at this point. So as we move forward, we see that we are going to have to switch and start, and we've thought about this before, but we're going to really have to start thinking about what do we do with these folks that we've put into these units now. What are we going to do with them in the future? They're going to need permanent supportive housing. They're going to continue to need medical supports. They may need treatment for a variety of different issues. So we are working through those issues, and that's part of what RSF4 will be looking at, is how do we manage those folks and get them out of the hotel motels, because the motels are going to want, or the hotel organizations are going to want their hotels back as the economy recovers. But we still need to have places to send people so that when the spike occurs, because there will be another spike in infections, that when that occurs, that there's a place for these folks to go and quarantine again. And it may not be able to be hotels again. So those are some of the issues that we're facing as RSF4. In addition to that, something you've already talked about, which is RSF4 will be looking at rental assistance and mortgage assistance. And as was spoken about earlier, we have all of these different funding sources, including the coronavirus relief funds, which both the City of Las Vegas and the County of Clark received. And County of Clark is put aside about $45 million so far. It hasn't actually gone to our board yet and been approved, but we are asking for $45 million to be set aside for things like rental assistance, food assistance, and other public services that are needed, including domestic violence counseling and supports, because we've seen a dramatic increase in domestic violence. So we are moving forward on all those fronts, and rental assistance will be a big part of that. And I think coordinating as a region is going to be very important, and coordinating with all of our affordable housing and regular housing providers is going to be very important, particularly in the Class C apartments, where a lot of the more marginal and at-risk households are living currently. And so I look forward to doing that. We'll be having our first RSF4 meeting today at 2 p.m. And that will include jurisdictions, along with our Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority. And Christine Hess from the Nevada Housing Coalition will be on that. And we're looking forward, and the state, of course. So we're looking forward to having that first meeting and discussing through a lot of the things that have been discussed today. Having a lot of this information is very helpful, and I'll be able to pass that along to that group of folks. Thank you.
Great report, Kristen. You certainly have your plate full with all that's going on in Clark County. We appreciate you being with us today. We'll now hear from the rural perspective on all of this and the efforts underway to address the housing issues we're facing in rural Nevada. Lena Frias is the Director of Rental Services for Nevada Rural Housing Authority and is on the front line of housing need in rural Nevada every day. Lena?
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to share information about our agency and programs today. As Bill mentioned, I am the Director of Rental Assistance Programs here at NRHA. Through our Housing Choice Voucher Program, more commonly known as Section 8, NRHA provides rental assistance to low-income, elderly, veteran, disabled, and homeless residents of our state. We also provide housing assistance through our emergency and security deposit assistance programs. And in addition to that, NRHA provides service coordination for homeless and senior residents, as well as referrals to community social service agencies for the elderly, disabled, and veteran applicants of our state. NRHA's jurisdiction covers 110,000 square miles of Nevada, which serves our state's 15 rural counties, which is everything except for Clark and Washoe counties. 68% of the clients that we serve on our HCV program are either elderly or disabled, and in addition to having mobility challenges, are also a vulnerable population due to health-related illnesses or concerns. NRHA has managed a successful emergency assistance program for several years. Our core program provides one-time funding assistance for rural Nevadans that are facing eviction, foreclosure, or utility shutoff, and provides assistance for multiple months of past due housing payments. Due to the pandemic, we've suspended the requirement of a foreclosure or eviction notice and just require proof of delinquency. The need for housing assistance is great within the state, and as an agency, we typically exhaust our funding every year. We routinely request additional funding support from the Nevada Housing Division, which provide us with the ability to keep this program operational. The pandemic is impacting so many within the state of Nevada, the country, and worldwide. And to bridge the gap and assist even more Nevadans during this crisis, we expanded our current emergency assistance program with additional grant funding. This fiscal year, we have tripled the amount of funding allocated for this program, providing additional support to those impacted during the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to our funding support from the Nevada Housing Division, we requested and received funding from the National Low Income Housing Coalition and the United Way. Emergency assistance program funding primarily assists with rent, mortgage, or utility payments. And one of our new funding sources also gives us the flexibility to provide additional aid to individuals having difficulty paying for groceries and household supplies necessary to maintain their safety and well-being. NRHA continues to adapt to the ever-changing dynamics of this healthcare crisis. These past few months, our call volume and electronic communication has dramatically increased, and we continue to manage this increase promptly, efficiently, with care, compassion, and empathy. Rural Nevadans are experiencing extreme financial difficulties, many of whom are currently experiencing housing insecurity relative to income, poor housing quality, overcrowding, neighborhood instability, homelessness, and the lack of available and affordable housing within our state. Many families are a step away from homelessness, and with the Nevada unemployment rate at a record high, we anticipate an alarming increase in evictions later this summer and into the fall. NRHA has a solid program structure in place to issue funding through our emergency services program quickly, responsibly, and efficiently. To be eligible for our emergency assistance programs, applicants must reside within our jurisdiction, and at least one household member must be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. The income cannot exceed program limits of 50% AMI. Proof of identity is required, as is verification of household income and verification of delinquency on lease, mortgage, or utility payments. And in addition to that, applicants cannot be a current recipient of any other subsidy under any federal, state, or local housing assistance program. Complete program details can be found on our website, and as a reminder, these programs provide one-time funding to rural Nevadans experiencing financial hardship and are limited to the 15 rural counties within our jurisdiction. In closing, I would like to comment that over the past few weeks, we have seen a rapid increase in inquiries and applications for housing assistance as word of our funding spreads. We anticipate these numbers will dramatically increase each week, escalating more rapidly once the moratoriums are lifted. The current pandemic is overshadowing the underlying need for affordable and available rental housing in Nevada, and we expect a dramatic increase in the number of residents needing rent subsidy and one-time emergency assistance. As the state continues to reopen, many individuals will not have employment to return to or may continue to have reduced incomes, and for many others, they will have to face the reality of repayment for rent or mortgage arrears. We are extremely concerned with the housing instability many Nevadans will face, yet NRHA would like to reaffirm that we remain dedicated to our mission of providing safe, attainable, and affordable housing for the residents of our state. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share this information, and I would be happy to answer later on in this discussion any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you, Lena. Great information. We appreciate all you're doing to serve the folks in rural Nevada. We surely appreciate all of our presenters this morning. We've received several questions from our participants during the webinar. We'll be posing those to our panelists and do our best to answer your questions with the time we have. If you have additional questions, please feel free to type those into the Q&A feature with the Zoom meeting, and we'll try to get those answered as best we can. If we can't get to them today, we will respond to you later, and those questions may help form the basis for additional informative webinars or newsletters. Our first question will go to Carol. You're still on, Carol, I hope?
Yes, I am.
Great. And you answered this directly in the Q&A, but I'd like everybody to hear your response on policy interventions. Will federal stimuli, like we saw in 2010, be needed? Is that a question of scale or magnitude?
Yes, I'm trying to find what I wrote because I've been trying to answer them as they come in. I mean, it's really clear if you talk to basically any economist, Fed Chair, the Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell, that now is not the time to stop providing financing, not the time to stop providing funds for rental assistance, for childcare, for low-income families, for nutrition assistance, for healthcare, transit agencies. I mean, there's just so many places, small business owners who've all been really hit hard by this pandemic. And so the $3 trillion bill that Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, and the Democrats in the House introduced yesterday really lays all the many different things that they recommend are response at the scale and the magnitude of the problem. Now, whether that happens, like any bill that, that we're considering, that depends on what people are asking for, where the votes are, where the interest is, how strong the support is. So we'll see. And I know the Chair Powell will be speaking before the Senate Banking Committee next Tuesday. And he gave a speech this morning where he said this isn't the time to stop investing at the scale to the problem. So I think, we can't just stop and assume things are going to get better. And I think what everybody said so far on the panel, including Lena, is most recently is true, that there's a huge demand for rental assistance and we're going to need funds for that.
I guess kind of a follow-up question on that, Carol, would be what's the likelihood of the proposed legislation getting through and largely
I have no clue. I don't think the Speaker Pelosi's bill is going to go through in its original form. I think the President and the White House, basically, I think they called it unserious in a tweet today. I haven't been able to keep up with the tweets. But and even, the bills that the senator that I talked about that we're working on, those aren't done deals either. We need feedback, we need support. It's really people saying this is the time to invest in our future and invest in what we need now. And the reason you have government is for insurance. So when things go badly, that government has the resources to help those who are hard hit, including the 20% who are really struggling to pay the rent.
Thanks, Carol. I know it's impossible to predict those things, but appreciate your addressing that for us. Treasurer Conine, I hope you're still on with us. Have a couple of questions for you. One is the estimated impact to Nevada on the lost taxes due to COVID, and how will that affect the state's ability to provide relief?
Bill, this is Eric Jimenez from the Treasurer's Office. I think the Treasurer had to jump. But on some preliminary numbers that we've seen for this fiscal year, which ends in June, we're seeing estimates between about 770 million and 900 and about 50 million. So it's kind of in that window. The legislature and the governor's office are continuing to evaluate what that looks like. I'm hesitant to kind of figure out what projections would be the following year, but the governor did declare a fiscal emergency on Monday, so we're continually evaluating that and making sure that we can respond appropriately.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate you jumping in. Kind of a follow-up question to that too is I know the state is scheduled to receive a pretty good chunk of relief from the CARES Act. Is there any thought about how those monies would be distributed or applied here in Nevada?
So yes, those conversations are happening. Decisions haven't been made. The state's portion was about $836 million. We were on the phone with the Assistant Treasury Secretary last week, getting some clarification on what those funds could be used for. I think it's important to mention that those CARES Act COVID relief funds can only be used for COVID response. So they cannot be used to backfill revenue gaps and those sorts of things. But for the people on this call, while it hasn't been determined what those allocations will look like yet, housing support and rental assistance is an approved use for those. So we'll definitely be looking at that as a potential solution for this fund.
That's wonderful to hear and appreciate that. Eric, I know some states have already made the decision to use some of that funding to assist with housing needs in their states. So hopefully Nevada will follow suit in that regard. We appreciate that. Let's go to Tammy and Kim with a question or two. The CDBG CV2 funding that's been distributed, good to know about that. Are there any additional flexibilities available with that funding? How might that be applied to our housing needs? Are you muted, Kim, perhaps?
I think because I tied to a pin, I have to be unmuted by the call convener.
You're on. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, great. The CDBG funds, and specifically the CV funds, are always designed to be extremely flexible in terms of the state or the entitlement jurisdiction defining how they're going to be used. In this moment, the CV funds are to prepare, address and prevent and respond to the coronavirus. So those funds have to be tied. The tieback is to, combating COVID-19. But there's a lot of flexibility there in terms of prevention monies, which is those that are impacted. How do we, prevent with, personal protective equipment? There's lots of funding around, funding activities in terms of temporary housing, acquisition of units. I've seen some very creative proposals in the last couple of months about things people want to do. I just actually flipped something to Steve. There are programs that are around economic development. We've seen tiebacks to, for example, you've got a robust restaurant industry. Can they potentially be providing meals to low-income individuals? It helps the businesses. It helps the low-income communities, the low and moderate-income communities that our programs are designed to predominantly assist, because 70% of the funds that we use for CDBG have to overall benefit low and moderate-income individuals. So those are the kinds of creative things that we're seeing happening, and we're very supportive, and we're going to try to interpret things in a way that allows, the highest and greatest impact for our communities in this moment.
Great, thank you very much. Steve, we have a couple of questions for you in terms of what the division is up to. Will there be any rental assistance in regards to past months due? I know some of the programs out there are kind of a 1 month or one-time assistance. What about those households who will have multiple months or longer running assistance needs than a one-time shot? Any programs available for that out there?
Bill, what we would have to do is sort of evaluate the funding sources and what waivers, because we have been given some broader authority under some of these programs than what is typical. As of right now, I probably couldn't answer that question, but that's something we will certainly look into.
Appreciate that. Steve, any thoughts on that, Lena, from the programs that you're administering?
For our programs right now, again, it's one-time funding, but it can assist with multiple months of arrears. So we are able to provide flexibility based on the different funding sources that we have to fund our emergency assistance programs. So definitely we can help anywhere from just 1 month to multiple months. But again, one-time basis.
Appreciate that. Question for
Bill, this is Kim. I just wanted to add that we have waivers authority that's built into the CARES Act for our programs for CDBG and Emergency Solutions Grant. So we're hoping that that flexibility, gives our grantees an ability to extend the assistance that they want to provide. And in addition to that, they can come in to request additional waivers in connection with our programs.
We appreciate that information. Very good. Thank you. It's kind of a question, and maybe Eric or Steve can help address this for us. Is there an overarching plan that's being developed by the state to address housing? Who would be driving the bus on putting that together?
So this is Steve. There are so many different funding sources and so many different needs, and you've heard it, from the local jurisdictions and what Clark County is doing. So I'm not going to commit to saying that there's an overarching single direction, but I will say that from our perspective, and I believe from the Treasurer's Office perspective, we absolutely are working with our partners on a statewide basis to get that funding out there.
Yeah, and this is Eric in the Treasurer's Office. I would agree with that, Steve. I think it's important to note that this is going to be a collaborative effort with the private sector, with government, and with our local partners as well. And that's the only way this is going to get solved. So we're on the phone almost every day. I think Steve is sick of me at this point, but everyone's committed to figuring something out.
They're always good conversations, Eric.
And this is Kim. From the federal perspective, because there are so many funding streams, there's so much to have to be considered and braided in terms of, respective program requirements. And so we're really encouraging our grantees to fund activities and then determine which funding pot they're going to use. What are the activities that we want to prioritize, and then which specific funding pots are we going to primarily turn to for those activities. Those funds run low, we're going to go to a secondary funding source, those kinds of things to help avoid, concerns around duplication of benefit and, using, one stream, for something that could have been better funded through another source.
Appreciate that, and that is part of the challenge. We have so many different funding streams, and within the state, so many different agencies who are touching this. It certainly asks the question, or begs the question, is there a central or a presiding figure that will help guide all of this in Nevada, or does that roll up to the governor's office? What do you think, Eric?
I do think the governor plays an important role in kind of setting a direction and a tone with how we respond. Again, this can be a collaborative effort, and obviously the governor helps set that agenda.
And kind of a follow-on question too, we know that there's going to be an interim legislative session to address the financial and budget impacts of the pandemic. As we know, conditions change daily, but are there any specific or significant considerations that we should prepare for on a housing issue, positive or negative? And when should we prepare for that?
This is Eric. I don't want to step out of my lane here. I think it's way too early to tell what a potential legislative session can bring. I think agencies are really trying to first figure out if they would need to make cuts, what those cuts would be, and where we are from a revenue perspective. But I think Carol brings up some important points. We're still waiting to see if there will be more federal action. So I think a lot of the housing stuff that we're waiting to see is if the federal government dedicates more resources to the state.
Appreciate that. And I know there's a lot of unknowns at this point, but we appreciate you guys taking a stab at it as best you can. Susie, appreciated the perspective from the Apartment Association. Do you think more landlords will be signing up to receive rental assistance in the near future?
I believe that many of our current participants in any HUD program are willing to look at that. We certainly, as an organization, have been encouraging our members to add units to programs such as Help Us Southern Nevada or any other housing or assistance programs for people that are either nearly homeless or families that are on the verge of becoming homeless. I don't know, given some of the hurdles with the Section 8 program, whether we'll see a number of landlords add that as part of their programs. But we certainly do encourage it. But we will actually reach around with HUD and the regional housing authorities in Nevada to see what we can learn from this response and how we can further simplify the program or improve the program so it's more attractive to our landlords.
Appreciate that. Question for Kristen. Will the RSF4 team be providing insights that may impact the distribution of Clark County CDBG and ESG funds?
Yes, I'm hoping that we can get some insights from the group because we have not determined where to use those funds yet. And it's also based on the fact that we do have all these other funding sources and we want to make sure that we're using the ones that are the most vulnerable to, well, the ones that have to be spent down first, we want to use first, and then we want to use the CDBG and ESG a little bit later if we have other funds that we can use. The big question has been all along is, what can those treasury funds in particular be used for? And just hearing that there are people who are actually talking to Treasury and finding out some of those answers, if you could share some of those answers, that would be really helpful. Because we sort of have questions about whether or not we can do any sort of capital expenditures or whether, like, can we use any of it to go out and, it doesn't look like we can, but just checking, can we let it go out and can we go out and use it to buy a hotel or something? So anyway, those are some of the thoughts I have. And I see Eric said, let's chat. Great. I will send you an email and hopefully that'll help. So we'll chat and then we'll all be sharing all this information. And yes, that will impact what happens with the Clark County allocations.
Thanks, Kristen. Should other groups be looking at your model and what you guys are doing there as a region in Clark County?
They can, absolutely. We have a great organization, the Southern Nevada Consortium, where we meet on a bi-monthly basis, all of the jurisdictions that receive HUD CPD funds and also the Continuum of Care and the Housing Authority and the state. And and HUD occasionally, we all sit around and talk about what the issues are as it relates to those funding sources, with the projects that we're all doing and where we can coordinate. And we coordinate on quite a few of the housing developments themselves where we have multiple funding coming in from both county and cities and state. So there's a lot of cooperation that already happens. And so I think that group is a good group to take any lead from because we as a group do a good job, I think, on allocating those resources effectively in the community.
Fabulous, thank you. One more quick question for Eric. Can you share some of the eviction prevention or rent relief programs that are being considered? I know Mr. Conine spoke about some of those that are under discussion.
I'm hesitant to do specific details because we are kind of in the midst of it. But broadly speaking, I think we're looking towards voluntary, not government mandated solutions that address primarily a lot of the concerns that people on this call have. Not how are we going to get 1 month of rent, but how do we avoid that 3 months or 4 months of backlogged rent that could happen as we get kind of into our recovery. So where we're looking at it is that these folks, some of the folks who haven't been able to get pandemic unemployment insurance yet, or some of the families who may have had both incomes kind of dropped, how can we wake up from this crisis as if it was kind of like a nap, for a better term, for lack of a better term, so we can figure out a solution where landlords, tenants, and the state coronavirus relief funds are kind of working collaboratively to address that kind of 3-month or 4-month hole, so that tenant could get back on their feet as quickly as possible. So I'm sorry, I can't really do a lot of specifics because we're kind of still in the heat of this, but it is a priority for most of us in the executive branch, and so glad that everyone keeps working on it with us.
Thank you so much, Eric. I know that's a tough question. We're out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. A special thanks to our participants, Carol Wayman from Senator Cortez Masto's office, State Treasurer Zach Conine and Eric Jimenez in his office, Tammy Thomas and Kim Nash with HUD, Meredith Levine from the Gwynn Center, Steve Acroft with NHD, Susie Bass